hosting the event. And I invite all of you, if you haven't looked at our website and the projects of ADA, we should invite you to look at it and to see and to join us online. For now, I just want to introduce Nancy Adler, who's going to introduce our keynote. Nancy is a professor of history at Amsterdam University, and there are a lot of other words that come after that. Director of a Genocide Studies Center, etc. So Nancy, please.
Thank you. So, it's my privilege to introduce Pablo de Greiff, who needs no introduction to this audience. Pablo is chair of the advisory board of Open Society Justice Initiative, member of the advisory board of the International Center for Transitional Justice, Universal Rights Group, and many other key organizations. He was appointed in December 2018 by the President of the UN Human Rights Council as rapporteur in the group of experts to advise the Council on its prevention role. He was the first special rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence, and that is actually one word and one title. And he held that position until May of 2018. He's also senior fellow and director of the Transitional Justice Program at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the School of Law at NYU. Prior to joining NYU, he was director of research at the ICTJ from 2001 to 2014, and he has published extensively. On a personal note, in 2015, I was arranging the closing conference of my Transitional Justice Research Program, a 4-year research program that eventuated in the volume Understanding the Age of Transitional Justice and a number of other publications. And I asked if Pablo could come in as keynote, and he was special rapporteur at the time, and he said regrettably he could not, but he was in Manila. And he said he would be willing to do the keynote from Skype in Manila, and I think it was midnight. I didn't forget, it was remarkable. He persevered, we had a lot of technical difficulties, midnight his time, and still he gave us a wonderful keynote, and I still appreciate that, and it was certainly memorable from our side. I was also privileged to see how Pablo gathered input at an expert meeting that you held in Stockholm in 2015 as special rapporteur. It was heartening to see the priorities you have included in transitional justice, to include educational reform and attention to the approach to and teaching of history, trauma counseling, measures that are not so much victim-specific, but actually aimed toward addressing the entrenched and very difficult culture of repression and the victimized society as a whole. And your attention to societal transformations that go beyond institutional interventions to interventions in the cultural sphere. Importantly, you've called for a refrain from persecuting, intimidating, and harassing civil society representatives, including human rights defenders, and addressing measures that restrict civil society organizations is certainly an aspiration that speaks widely to the public today. So allow me to thank you for articulating this priority. And with that, I'd like to give you the
floor. Before anything else, can you hear me in the back?
Only a few.
Okay.
Let's see, maybe that would be.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this any better? No?
Because we need to really hold it.
Yeah, speak closer.
I will hold it very well.
Yeah.
So, before anything else, this is a very precise mic. So, before anything else, thank you, Nancy, for that very Most of all, thanks to all of you for taking the time to come. I hope that this will be worth your while. I hope you can also take seriously someone that has this thing on his head. My almost teenage kids asked me the day before yesterday when I came back on like this, do you have an electronic thing implanted? Something like a parabolic antenna, which I wish I had because then I wouldn't have to worry about making sense today. My 4-year-old daughter, by contrast, less used to be, at least in the short run, but much more acutely, asked me, did you have an egg implanted? So neither. I will, however, engage in a natural experiment. I am very sorry that you will have to witness it, which is to see whether the drugs that we have read about so often actually help or hinder lecturing. So let's see whether this works. I want to be brief because I would love to have a conversation, and not just because I am not in my greatest shape. But I will divide my intervention in 4 brief points. Ultimately, of course, I would like to take advantage of the brilliant topic that was chosen for this whole conference, the idea of preventive activism, which Nancy intimated is very close to my interests. But before getting there, I will divide the brief intervention into 4 parts of an equal length. I would like to say something about my perception about the state of dealing with the past generally and of transitional justice in particular. In the first part, I will say something about its achievements. In the second part, I will say something about the challenges that I think it faces. Those will be less than half of my intervention. The third and fourth parts, which is where I would like to concentrate my attention, have to do with the general topic of prevention and the role of dealing with the past in a preventive spirit. Again, going back to the general topic of the conference. And in the final part, I will say something about, specifically, about what I see as the preventive role of civil society organizations. So let me start with the first part. I think that there's a lot that can be celebrated in the way that the field has operated in the last 30 years. And I speak about this very often, so I don't want to make a big deal out of this. I perhaps would like to say, as a summary, that there is a sense in which dealing with the past and transitional justice has achieved normative change at the international level in a fairly short period of time. That now it is perfectly normal to expect countries that are undergoing certain types of transitions to implement measures to address their own past. And this really happened in a fairly short period of time. And anyone that has tried to accomplish this sort of normative change internationally would appreciate the accomplishment. This is not so easy to do. Now, and this was preceded by an accomplishment that is internal to the field itself. It could not have been taken for granted 30 years ago that what we now call transitional justice would succeed in coalescing as a field. Anyone who knows something about the history of the field would remember, for example, the huge debates between the defenders of truth versus the defenders of justice. So any field that defends a multiplicity of measures faces some centrifugal forces. And in the case of transitional justice, these were especially strong centrifugal forces, so that the field managed, again in a fairly short period of time, to mitigate at least some of these internal debates was also an accomplishment. So in 2001, you may still recall when the ICTJ was established, Reed Brody at Human Rights Watch wrote the notorious article. I don't make this critically because Reed is my friend. Human Rights Watch and the ICTJs are allies. These things are all part of the past. But in the article, Reed wrote suspiciously about the human rights shop established close to Wall Street, whose task was, in a certain sense, to whitewash human rights violations in favor of truth and at the expense of justice. So that was 2001. 2004, the Secretary General of the UN already wrote his report, the first report that Secretary General writes about this on transitional justice and the rule of law. And by then, he already wrote confidently about transitional justice being a comprehensive, holistic policy, mentioning 4 different elements: truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, as part of a single set. So the idea that these were competing measures, underlined by competing and incompatible values, had already been solved by 2004. And since then, of course, there are still lots of internal and external debates and opposition to the field, but this is not one of those. People continue to think about the complementarities between the different elements of transitional justice rather than about the incompatibilities. And I think that this is also an achievement. So that the field managed to consolidate itself, there is no question about that. This is a field academically. You are here at Columbia University, there are master's students, PhD theses, there is a specialized journal, and for those of you interested in the sociology of knowledge, as I am, its very own encyclopedia. And you would know that a specialized encyclopedia sociologically is an important marker of a field at least considering itself to be autonomous from an intellectual standpoint. So Cambridge published in 2012 the Encyclopedia of Transitional Justice, and sociologically I think that this was an important standpoint. That it is a field of policy making internationally, there's absolutely no question. The international cooperation mechanisms invest in transitional justice measures. There is diplomatic pressure on countries undergoing transitions in order to implement some form of transitional justice. A great deal of pressure on countries that fail to do it. Think about, for example, the relationship between Sri Lanka and the Human Rights Council around the issue of transitional justice and its progress or lack of progress in the implementation of these programs. So the international community cares about this, invests on it, creates sections in ministries in order to deal with this sort of work. So this is an autonomous field of action. And again, if you take into account the short period of time in which all of this happened, and even if you compare it with how long similar things took with respect to other fields, including peace building, you would see that there is something of an accomplishment behind all these things. Now, much more importantly, from my perspective, I think that the field has something to celebrate in the world, not just with respect to the consolidation of its own area of activity. I think that, again, to be very, very brief, in order not to prolong myself on this, I think that transitional justice contributed to unpacking a certain understanding of justice and redress, which helps explain also why we are here today. That around that unpacking of the notion of justice and redress, things like memory and history and truth and memorialization and museums and symbolic redress and a whole host of measures have coalesced, and I think that it is arguable that transitional justice played a catalytic role in launching those developments. But again, more importantly, I think, and very, very concretely, I think that transitional justice helped to give concrete content and life to rights that otherwise would have been nothing more than documents. Rights, some of which were already in the books, some of which we have been introduced in the books subsequently, but that without the practical implementation, they would still be fictional for the vast majority of people that presumably would have been the subject of those rights. So, for example, even in the sphere of criminal justice, which of course long predated transitional justice, but the transitional justice contributed ways of making the rights concrete, the right to justice concrete, not just doctrinally, but in practice, by, for example, teaching people how to think about the mitigation of amnesty strategies, how to think about the mitigation of retroactivity and legitimacy and legality programs, how to think about something that the typical prosecutor never thinks about, which is the design of broad prosecutorial strategies. These are things that we have learned through the implementation of transitional justice measures, and they have helped to give concrete reality to the right to justice. In the domain of truth, of course, the right to truth it has become a concrete, realizable right through mechanisms that were largely contributed by transitional justice, largely but not exclusively through truth commissions, the sort of institutional form that transitional justice is most often associated with. And I think that, again, there have been very important contributions made concretely in order to give life to the right of justice, something that otherwise was nothing more than an abstraction. Similarly, in the domain of reparations, although the history of interstate reparations is a very long one, illustrated by, among others, by Lazarus' work, as well as others. The history of intrastate reparations, the state giving reparations to individual victims, to which many of you, including Carla and of course Yael, have contributed a lot to. That the establishment of massive administrative reparation programs in transitional justice efforts have contributed a lot to giving concrete content to the right to reparation that otherwise would have been largely aspirational. That in addition to the establishment of administrative massive programs, the idea of the complexity of the benefits that those programs are supposed to distribute has contributed a lot to making, I don't want to say, life-changing contributions to the life of victims, but at least not insignificant contributions to the lives of many of them. So I think that there are some accomplishments that need to be celebrated. So that's my first part, goal, transitional justice. Now, my second part is a bit more realistic, perhaps a bit gloomier. I think that, of course, it's not all rosy. I personally think that transitional justice is at a huge crossroads, and that it is facing a challenge, three sets of challenges that can be described in the very same sentence, but that can be disaggregated and analyzed in turn. although I think that at the end they are related to one another. I think that transitional justice has become indifferent to content, that it has become formulated, and that it has become a bit too technocratic. So let me take those in turn very briefly. It has become indifferent to context because when at least I think about the trajectory of transitional justice work, the origins, of course, can be traced in the Latin American transitions of the Southern continent. And those were, of course, transitions with very, very specific characteristics. The first of which I would like to mention is that they were post-authoritarian transitions. The second characteristic that I would like to mention is that these were, by saying that they were post-authoritarian transitions, I mean to suggest that these were transitions in relatively highly institutionalized contexts. The institutions of Chile and Argentina, for example, were both vertically and horizontally strong. They were horizontally strong in the sense that they had the capacity to make themselves present in every corner of those countries' territories, which of course doesn't mean that they did, but it means that they could have, that they had the capacity, and that if they did not, there was a decision not to provide the same sort of services in Patagonia as they were provided in Buenos Aires. But the possibility was there. The institutions were capable of doing so. They were vertically very highly institutionalized countries in the sense that these were not countries with huge legal black holes. Most of the important spheres of relationship between citizens and the institutions of the state were already regulated by means of law. And again, here a caveat. It doesn't mean that all those laws were either equally well implemented, even less that they were wise. But nevertheless, the state had the capacity to regulate its interactions with the state citizens in a way that was distinctive and effective. Now, from there, transitional justice work moved to the Central and Eastern European cases, states with similar characteristics, then to South Africa, and after South Africa, a very rapid process of diffusion all over the world. And now the bulk of transitional justice work takes place in a very different sort of context, namely post-conflict contexts, and furthermore, weakly institutionalized post-conflict contexts. And I want to say that this is an entirely different world, that the state institutions are neither horizontally nor vertically as well institutionalized as they were in the original post-authoritarian transitions, but also that the types of violations that call for redress are very different in those contexts. That, of course, there is a relationship between institutional capacities and not just virtuous state action, but vicious state action, namely human rights violations, that the type of redress that transitional justice measures, as was originally conceived, were designed to redress a very narrow categories of violations, typical of the exercise of abusive state power, and that is also different in the weakly institutionalized post-conflict contexts, in which it's not just a question of different state capacity, but that the range and the type of violations is also very different. In the latter context, not being so closely reflective of the abusive exercise of state power, but something that is much more akin to the outcome of social conflagration. And that therefore the presuppositions, institutional presuppositions, that made plausible to think about the original model of transitional justice as an adequate response to the post-authoritarian transitions and to the violations that they left in their wake are not assumptions that can safely be made in the new context of application, and that therefore, not surprisingly, we are finding it much more difficult to achieve effective results in the new contexts where we are applying the very same model. I find it very suspicious that despite our rhetoric, including mine, all of this is a commentary about transitional justice practitioners, in which of course I include myself. But I find it very suspicious that one can go from Santiago and Buenos Aires to Kinshasa and Bujumbura and give more or less the same recommendations. I don't think that that makes any sense. And therefore, I don't think it is surprising that it is much more difficult to do transitional justice on the same model in Bujumbura as it was in Santiago and Buenos Aires. And I mentioned Bujumbura also because I was there repeatedly with an understanding of transitional justice which is paradigmatic. Now, what I am saying is there is a certain indifference to context that I think it is very important for the field to overcome. Now, secondly, and relatedly, I think that the field is becoming formulaic, that this set of pillars, as they were called, including in my mandate, and as Nancy said, I think that I had the most ridiculous title of anyone in the United Nations system, being the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion of Truth, Justice, Reparations, and Guarantees of Non-Recurrence. Made it impossible to sign guest books. You have to say, do you have 15 minutes? The title that only takes about 12 minutes. That had the virtue, and of course there's a long history that we can talk about of how that title came to be given to the mandate. It had a long history and also some virtues in the sense that, for example, it allowed us, and allowed me to evade questions about when does a transition start, when does a transition end. The word transition was never mentioned in the resolution that created the mandate, and therefore I could safely avoid it, and there is some advantages to that. It had the advantage of being also very descriptive. This is what the mandate is about. It's about the promotion of the rights to truth, to justice, to reparations, and to guarantees of non-recurrence. And there is an advantage to that. When I was newly appointed, because the mandate was new, I very, very rapidly came to understand that despite the fact that the resolution had been adopted by consensus at the Human Rights Council, most of the member states that had voted in favor of the resolution didn't have the slightest idea of what they had signed up to. And that therefore, one of the first tasks was to educate the states about what this was about. And hence my commitment to write a report on each of the pillars of the mandate. But going back to the question about the formalization of the field, transitional justice is not the only field that is affected by what organizational sociologists call isomorphic mimicry, the tendency to think that the very same institutional formation functions equally well in every context. Think about, for instance, what has happened with anti-corruption commissions. Once the international community came to the idea of an anti-corruption commission, the idea was that every country should establish one of exactly the same characteristics as if corruption functioned in the same way in every country, which of course we know is totally and absolutely senseless. Well, the same thing has happened, I believe, with the transitional justice. The question for transitional justice promoters ceased to be what is the most effective way of realizing the rights of victims to truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. The question has become what is the most efficient way of establishing a truth commission, a reparations program, a prosecutorial mechanism, and then guarantees of non-recurrence no one cares about, so they can be left aside. But again, the obsession is with the institutional form rather than with the most effective way of realizing rights. In April of last year, I visited the Gambia, where, by the way, I think that a truth commission could actually really work. But in the Council of Ministers, I asked them, how did you come with the idea of establishing a truth commission? I was interested in knowing the process of deliberation that had brought them there. They looked at one another. Finally, one of them said, well, isn't this what we are supposed to do? And this is not, I hasten to add, this is a story that I tell not in criticism of the Gambians, in criticism of us that have transmitted to countries like the Gambia that their obligation is to establish a truth commission. And again, I happen to think that in the Gambia, a truth commission can do very important work. But that is not equally true in every country that is now trying to establish a truth commission, including the country where I was born, Colombia, where the type of violence that took place during the 50+ years of the conflict was totally unlike the authoritarian violence that depended on secrecy and a lack of transparency. Violence in Colombia, for the most part, was completely public in everyone's face, and therefore the need for truth and the possible task of a truth commission is, of course, very different from what it could be in a country in which people were disappeared in secret. So we need to think about this. But the point is, I think that we have become too obsessed now with forms rather than with rights. And finally, the related problem is that we have become technocratic. We have become obsessed precisely with the establishment of technical fixes. We have turned transitional justice into an exercise of clever institutional engineering, and I think that it's much more than that, and that the original understanding of transitional justice, which at the heart of it had a certain understanding of principled pragmatism rather than of institutional blueprints, has been eroded over time. Now, the history of why that has happened is itself complicated. Part of it obeys the advantages of very, very steep learning processes in a world that is interconnected. So now there's a lot of learning in between cases. Part of it has to do with the fact that the field was professionalized. So we professionalize it here. No? We have students with PhDs. And the process of professionalization is one of establishing credentials, meaning that you have mastery over the existing ways of doing things. And there is a price to be paid for that. Of course, lots of advantages, but also some disadvantages. The tendency towards replication, for instance, is a risk of fields that have become professionalized. So again, there's a long history that can be told about that, but the point is that we concentrate on this. Here again, I hasten to add that this is not a problem just with the transitional justice. This sort of, again, another manifestation of mimicry, disciplinary fueled in part, is characteristic of many, many fields of policy intervention. I don't think that transitional justice is significantly worse off than others, except for one thing, that I think that at the core of the transitional justice process, there was a richness of both normative conceptions and understanding of social change, and the tools that would have enabled a much better use of the normative resources that are characteristic of a transition. That, for example, the more technocratic a transitional truth commission becomes, the more it usually comes at the expense of normative work that I think a truth commission is particularly well suited to do, whereas a World Bank report or a report from the International Bar Association is not nearly in an equally good position to make. So the question for me is about the best use of resources and about what you pay for investing your resources in rather than opportunity costs. Now, third part of my intervention has to do specifically with what I left aside before, namely the question of guarantees of non-recurrence. So just a very, very brief history about this very weird notion. No one outside the field of transitional justice knows what the hell guarantees of non-recurrence refers to. It's a UN expression. In fact, there's only a handful of documents within the UN that refer to the notion directly. The first one, the report done by Louis Journet, which was under he was charged with this by the former Human Rights Commission. And his task was to come up with principles in the fight against impunity. And he wrote them having the Latin American Southern Cone regimes in mind. And therefore, he was the first to talk about these four pillars of justice, truth, reparations, and the term that he introduced, the guarantees of non-recurrence. This term was taken up in the update of those very same principles that, again, the Human Rights Commission entrusted Diana Rentlicker to do in 2005. The Secretary General, in his 2004 report, used the notion, borrowing explicitly from Journet and from the early draft of Diane's update. And in all of these cases, guarantees of non-recurrence referred, at least in part because of the background, to a very narrow set of measures having to do with the security sector reform. Journet talked about the disbandment of parastatal armed groups, death squads, groups that operated under the shadow of the law. He talked about the vetting of security sector, of certain types of security sectors officials. And this narrow understanding of security sector reform was the one that the Secretary General adopted in his 2004 report, which goes directly from a reference to security sector, to guarantees of non-recurrence, to a reference about vetting of the security sector. Now, the only other document within the system that addresses this notion directly is in passing the draft of the draft articles of state responsibility done by the International Law Commission in Article 13, which uses the expression guarantees of non-recurrence in a slightly broader sense. But in any case, the main point is this is an expression with a very, very narrow and relatively poor documentary background, but it is one that I think is absolutely critical. I think that it was part of the normative promise of transitional justice in the idea of never again. I think that this was, of course, a very, very important motivating engine for many people in undertaking transitional justice work. And I want to add, it's one which I think is particularly important in these times, which I want to say are very, very difficult times for human rights work. Human rights, even for former friends and defenders, has become a very, very undesirable vocabulary. I tell my wife that I used to, in 2002, you may remember, Najev published his book about human rights as politics and idolatry, thinking about transitional justice as a sort of vernacular language, which is universally used in order to articulate all sorts of claims. So I told my wife recently I felt I used to talk this fantastic vernacular language. Now I feel like I'm an Esperanto speaker. Who talks Esperanto anymore? Really, even the French are trying to distance themselves from the notion of human rights. I think part of it, and again, this is a sort of exercise in self-reflection, the human rights community has made several mistakes along the way. We are absolutely tremendously capable of being utopian, but in a very bad sense. We are very good at describing desirable end states, but usually lousy at telling people how to get from here to there. Part of it, I also think, has interesting sociological, disciplinary roots. Lawyers, I must say, are not very good at policy making, and because the field is highly dominated by lawyers, this is a professional handicap that the field has inherited, and this is true both of common law lawyers and lawyers in the civil law tradition. But in any case, the problem goes far beyond that, and I think that it is a very serious problem. States now perceive the vocabulary of human rights as an anti-state, anti-security, pro-small minority vocabulary in which they have very, very little interest. And part of the fault, I think, is ours. We need to become much better at seizing the empty, abstract utopianism of desirable end states and getting our hands dirty in the very difficult job of providing solutions to the problems that we are so good at pointing out. In that context, thinking about prevention, which I think is how guarantees of non-recurrence should be described, I think is particularly important. So now a few words about the state of prevention discussions, which is also in many ways dismal. So the Secretary General came with the idea of saying prevention is not just one of the aims I want to promote, it is my agenda. It's not just one part of my agenda, it is my agenda. Over time, I think that the enthusiasm has fizzled out completely. And that therefore, some of the things that could have been said about prevention discussions before the no longer so new Secretary General can still be said. In other words, prevention work continues to be very, very heavily oriented towards crisis prevention. And crisis prevention is, of course, important. I don't want to argue against it. But it has many problems. The first one of which is that, of course, anything that is capable of triggering an early warning system suggests that there is a lot of prevention work that we have simply failed to do. The second one, which is more political, is that discourse about crisis prevention heavily centers on diplomatic good offices and in the way in which the international community can play a role in the prevention of conflict, in particular member states. And therefore, the resistance of member states to talk about prevention, thinking that this is a backdoor to intervention into their internal affairs, is huge. So Nancy was kind enough to mention that I'm part of the so-called group of experts appointed by the Human Rights Council to deal with the prevention potential of the Council, for which we have organized 2 intersessional seminars with member states. In each of them, more than 80 member states have asked for the floor. And I don't exaggerate much by saying that 75 of those interventions have been to say prevention is a backdoor to R2P, to the responsibility to protect, and therefore we have no interest in this notion. We have no interest in this project. So I think that this is a problem that we still have to overcome. The fundamental problem with discussions about prevention, both within the United Nations and outside the system, is not just that they concentrate too much on crisis prevention, is not even that there is no knowledge about what is effective in the domain of prevention, is that our knowledge and expertise about prevention is totally fragmented. We actually know a lot about prevention, except that the sorts of things that truly prevent human rights violations never make it to a discussion that concentrates on crisis prevention and diplomatic good offices. To illustrate, for instance, place-based policing, community-based policing strategies are extraordinarily effective mechanisms for the prevention of human rights violations by police forces. You never talk about that in discussions about prevention within the United Nations system. I happen to think, and please keep in mind that I try to avoid both the extremes of romanticism on the one hand and utopianism on the other, or cynicism as well. I happen to believe that, for example, the process of articulating a Bill of Rights, not just producing a text, but articulating a Bill of Rights with the participation of people, endowing it with enforcement mechanisms like a constitutional court, is immensely preventive overall. There's, of course, a mountain load of literature on constitutional courts, none of which deals with the preventive potential of constitutional courts. But it has huge preventive potential. Again, this is the sort of thing that we never talk about in discussions about prevention. So, again, to summarize, because I don't want to go on much longer, I think that it would be very, very important to have a framework approach to prevention, a sort of matrix, not a blueprint, but a matrix of measures that countries have found to be useful in the prevention of human rights violations in very, very different areas, but including all those that, because they do not belong to the idea of crisis prevention, are usually left out of consideration. And then I will finish with this, the fourth part of my introduction. Such a matrix, and again going back to the idea that this is not simply a project in a clever institutional engineering, has to include the preventive potential of interventions that do not simply consist in institutional reforms. I happen to think that, for example, civil society organizations have a huge preventive potential that goes well beyond the way in which they are pigeonholed in functions of reporting, monitoring, and advocacy. That tightly knit civil society is itself a preventive mechanism. And of course, I also happen to be fully aware of the fact that civil society is not direct part of a state, and that therefore it is unlikely to respond to policy initiatives as if it were. But I think that it is incredible lack of imagination and, in a certain sense, lack of attention on our part. When I ask people, what could, for example, an interested state do to strengthen its civil society, that the only answer that we have is repeal laws that limit civic space. That is, of course, an obvious place to begin, but it cannot be our last answer. I know no transition whose success has not depended ultimately on civil society. I cannot think of a successful Chilean transition without the activities of the Vicariata Solidaridad, the interfaith group that helped to collect files, provided support to victims. I cannot think of the Argentinian transition being successful without the work of CELS, the Center for the Study of Legal and Constitutional Issues, that did something similar. It is, of course, unthinkable to conceive the success of the Polish and more broadly the Central and Eastern European transitions without the work of solidarity. But even in more recent transitions, the Tunisian success, such as it is, would not have been possible with the work of trade unions that started the work long before the revolution started. The Spanish transition is unthinkable without the work of the UGT, the large labor union. So my point is, if we want successful transitions, I think that we are going to have to think much more thoroughly about ways in which we can strengthen civil society and not just ways in which we can reform existing state institutions. That project, I want to say, is in a certain sense a non-starter in most of the countries where we are now working and finding it very difficult to find success. That includes the DRC, CAR, Mali, places in which no one could reasonably think that success will come simply from the reform of existing state institutions. It has to come from strengthening people in the idea that they are rights holders, that being a citizen, not in the sense of immigration, but in the constitutional sense of being a holder of rights, means something. It depends on having a culture in which, for example, the idea of solving problems through the law makes much more sense than solving problems by hiring a sicario, as for decades happened in the country where I came from. So there are aspects both of civil society and of cultural interventions and interventions in the domain of personal dispositions, the wellsprings of social solidarity, the way in which we perceive risks are absolutely fundamental, and transitional justice, I think, is forgetting this altogether. Because I could not attend the previous panel, in which I was not only very interested in, but I was supposed to be a part of. I will make my closing remark in connection with this. It was no mystery to me that, for example, all the leaders, without exception, all the leaders of the CNDD, the ruling party in Burundi, were people whose parents were murdered in previous rounds of violence. We need to confront the intergenerational effects of violence in the way that Yael primarily, but also others, have been talking about much more effectively. And again, this is not simply a question of clever institutional engineering. This is something like the older sociologists used to say, and I happen to believe that they were totally right, and that we should go back to this idea. Sustainable social change requires work on institutions, but also on culture and personal dispositions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. This was excellent, and I think you could have heard a pin drop here during your talk. So I hardly need to summarize, but I just want to recap a few things. You initially discussed that in 20 to 30 years there is much to be celebrated in the field of transitional justice, but there are also a great number of challenges. I hope we can continue our conversation and talk about those. We have reached an important crossroads in the field. I think that we're all feeling that now, and context is something that needs quite a bit of attention. You moved on to guarantees of non-recurrence, and then turned to the state of prevention discussions with saying that among other things, that civil society has hugely preventive potential. And I know there are a lot of questions, but I just wanted to take the moderator's privilege and for a moment address guarantees of non-recurrence, but look at that as, well, discuss guarantees of recurrence, unfortunately. I think that one of the major problems that we are having is the failure of transitional justice to take root in societies where we are battling with a culture of repression. And that would be societies very often from which the perpetrators came, let's say, returning perpetrators to Serbia or Rwanda, an understanding of some of the, how can we address such cultures of repression, or in societies that are completely non-cases of transitional justice, where civil society cannot realize its potential because it in itself is being repressed. And what is also being repressed is the victims' narratives, because the marginalization of the victims' narratives is also where it begins. I know it's a huge thing to throw out there, but you gave some very optimistic messages, and this is one of the bigger problems that you're uniquely qualified to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I don't think that I'm uniquely qualified to address this, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about this. Look, I have to confess that I take this as a meeting amongst friends and colleagues. In any case, people who are trying to move more or less in the same direction. I am as affected as everyone else by what I see happening all around us, including, and in some ways, primarily in this country. I think that what is happening here is tremendously influential in a very negative way in everything that has to do with human rights and justice-related work. I think that the normalization of insult and humiliation and discrimination is something that erodes norms that were supposed to be absolutely fundamental. I remember after the election, hearing a former comedian saying to all former Americans who pretended not to be racist, I beg you, go back to pretending because it was much better than that. So, no, I think that there is a lot of cultural shifts that are very, very deeply troubling and that manifest themselves in quantifiable ways. So in virtually every country that used to have this problem more or less under control, anti-Semitic attacks are on the rise, racist attacks are on the rise. I mean, there is a sort of divisiveness that makes working on these issues, including issues dealing with the past, much more difficult. So I am affected very deeply by this, and I am one of those that, I confess, I read many more newspapers than I used to before. And it's not clear at all that it does me any good. In fact, I am confident that it doesn't. But amongst all this gloom, I still want to say there are certain things that we should not lose sight of. Of course, like many other people, I was interested in the parallels between what is happening right now and the 20s and 30s. And yes, there are some parallels, but I don't want to lose track of progress either. I think that the world has learned something about personal autonomy, and that people do not like being bossed around in the same way that they didn't mind. I don't know whether they liked, but they didn't mind being bossed around. And that a good demonstration of this is that none of the populist authoritarian leaders have dared to call people on the street in front of the house of an opponent and say, for example, I want 50,000 people in front of Speaker Pelosi's house. That hasn't happened. And I think that there is a lot to be said for the difficulties of getting this done. Mind you, it's not that the world is completely lack of mobilization. We are seeing in Latin America huge mobilizations. But in Spain, there were huge mobilizations about pension reform a few months ago. But there is an important factor to keep in mind. All of these were self-directed, self-organized mobilization. And if any political party would have said, I am running this, or I am inviting people out on the street, that would not have worked at all. And I think that that combination of the capacity to mobilize on the one hand, and the ability to exercise that capacity autonomously is a reason for hope. Secondly, like many other people, I think that changes in gender relationships are immensely influential, and that the potential for changes in political dynamics and in dynamics between the citizens depends a lot on this. And finally, I think that youth movements, and I have to confess that because this is not my area, I was never too attuned to this sort of thing. I did not pay attention to this until quite recently, but that there is a lot of potential in the participation and the involvement of youth in some of these discussions. That this is a group of people that comes to the issues with a very different mental geography, as it were, where ideological lines cut in entirely different ways. Some of them have become completely irrelevant. And that's a very good demonstration of this, for instance, and a demonstration of the fact that it is still possible not just to reform institutions and laws, but also to reform cultural attitudes, is what has happened with LGBT rights, again, in a fairly short period of time. It is still possible to carry out positive social transformation. And then the question is, what can we do in order to give more potential to this? And I want to say, in my experience, for instance, there are certain things that happen. Of course, laws that limit civic space do not help. So something like 90 laws were adopted between 2012 and 2015 in 50 countries, laws that limited the operation of civil society organizations. So that doesn't help. But there are other things that help. Legal empowerment programs help a lot, because legal empowerment is the sort of thing that helps give reality to the notion of being a rights holder, that facilitates the association not just between individuals, but between groups. That helps. The establishment of platforms or networks of civil society organization helps. I don't think that we will go back to the days when the bulk of civil society organization was done by trade unions. So that is a model of organization of labor that depended on industrial labor largely. I totally bemoan the loss of labor unions, and I totally believer in the very positive role that labor unions can play. And one of the roles that they played, and that no one is playing presently, is that they educated membership not just on labor law, but on general issues about politics and rights. So I asked my wife, who is Welsh, after Brexit, what did you get in school about the EU? She said, nothing. In the EU, no one in school is ever educated about the European Union. Who is doing education about constitutional rights to students in this country? I have 3 kids of that age in American schools, which are supposed to be schools that are supposed to be very good. No one has ever mentioned anything about constitutional let alone human rights to these kids. By contrast, in the Gambia, for example, one of the things that I met were lots of young people who were trying to establish NGOs to educate fellow citizens into the meaning of having rights. And I think that these sorts of things are absolutely, absolutely fundamental. I was rereading, because I am a compulsive reader, all the literature about cultural transformation. So Mannheim, for example, in the immediate after-war years, about how to transform cultures in Europe towards more democracy. And again, there's nothing new. What are the elements of cultural transformation in Mannheim's work? Education, religion, and civic organization. In an entirely different setting, rereading Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities about the creation of national identities. What were the instruments for the creation of national identities? Vernacular languages, national dictionaries and encyclopedias, a local press published in local languages, local administration, things that we know. So I think that we have gotten so used to the idea that the state plays these roles and that it comes as a matter of fact, that we have forgotten the idea that people, new generations need to be educated again in what it means to be part of a democracy, for example, to what it means to be part of a society in which differences are respected. And I of course have a few more things to say, but all of them of this totally banal, not new sort of sense, I will shut up. But I will just say, we have to go back to this question. How is it possible that, for example, we have billions, if not more, hundreds of billions of dollars spent globally on advertising, private industry advertising, for the creation of needs, largely for totally superfluous goods, but very successfully, because that investment shows absolutely no signs of declining. And it would have declined if firms have decided that this was ineffective. We have to learn a bit from authoritarians. We have, really, we have to learn a bit about what is effective in creating a sense of solidarity, in creating the sense that we are in this together, that there are certain differences that matter and certain differences that do not matter. And of course, I'm not advocating for the big, broader educational state, but I am advocating for us thinking a bit harder, not simply saying the only thing that we have to do is to reform laws and all other problems will take care of themselves, because they won't. And what we are seeing today shows that they won't. And finally, and I will finish this part with this, I perhaps will sound like I'm old Marxist, old in this way as well, but I think that the idea of social transformation without some impact on the economic opportunities of people is completely insane. And that there is absolutely no mystery in our suspiciousness and skepticism about politics when the distribution of wealth, of income, and of services is what it is today. We have to be serious about this.
Thank you. This idea of local, very important idea about local ownership of the process. I'm going to turn the questions over to the audience. I think probably we should, well, I was going to say we should collect them, but I see, well, you know what? Okay, yeah, let's collect them. So I'm going to give to Dale, and then let me just, we'll ask the questions, then Nicole, and then Lisa. And so we'll start with four, okay, we'll take 4 questions in a row, and then Pablo will answer. Yeah.
Probably more a comment you didn't mention health as a multidisciplinarity as an absolute necessity of involvement if you're talking about doing good on anything. So that's what our center is for, so I wanted to mention that. Also, having been a part of creating the remedy resolution, the idea of guarantees for non-repetition came from victims saying never again. Not from Joannet. Joannet sort of took it as yes, so what kind of institution should we deal with for that? But he didn't think it was the end of the thinking about it. It's just that at the time it was quite urgent to get it done after waiting for 13 years for this resolution to happen. So if I were, and maybe we can do it together, if I were to revisit guarantees of non-repetition, I would start from the victim's call. And again, ask victims, what for them, what do they mean when they say never again? Which part of it? Not to repeat it. Okay?
Can I ask you to reserve your response? And Nicole, either you can stand up and speak very loudly, or yeah.
Yeah. It's okay.
Thank you.
My question is about translation. You started with starting off saying that transitional justice is an interdisciplinary field, and that this is also one of its successes, that it has, built some substance in the last decades. However, you also gave this example of how difficult it is that the anthropological knowledge we have, for example, what happens on communities in terms of resilience and so, is translated back onto the legal level. And I wondered if there is this gap between anthropological knowledge and legal practice, why then we have this large gap as we are an interdisciplinary field. It would be nice if you could elaborate on that.
I believe that there was a, yes.
Questions about two countries in either hemisphere that have had dramatic transformations. One being Rwanda, which seems to be going vertical in terms of economic development. Half the parliament is women now. It's looked at as a tech producer, yet it's an autocratic model. And then on this hemisphere, you had the extraordinary indigenous success in Bolivia. Unfortunately, Morales did not want to do it in a democratic form. And you've had this horrible backlash, profoundly racist, right now that may cause that to completely unravel. So there's sort of examples of justice coming in, but I don't know if they're stable and what do they really mean.
And there was a fourth here,
Yeah.
and then we're going to let Pablo respond, and then we can go back to it.
So I may have misunderstood, but I think you said, just to go back to an earlier part of your talk. Sorry? Oh, yeah. To go back to an earlier part of your talk, that you said that the goals of human rights was a mistake. I think that's the word you used, but maybe I misunderstood that. If it's true, I mean, so maybe it isn't, but I believe you can make an argument that it was kind of a top-down mistake, as you're now arguing for a bottom-up approach. But the other side of the argument would be that it provided a grammar of what we mean by moving forward in these societies. So I think a little bit of clarification would help.
Why don't you take those, we need the microphone back.
So let me start with the clarification, because I didn't mean to say that the goals of human rights were a mistake. I think that the human rights community has made a slight mistake in becoming technocratic and too concerned with the end states rather than with the provision of solutions, of pathways to those goals. So I am a total supporter of the idea of human rights. I do not think that it is merely Esperanto, although sometimes I feel that way, I have to confess. But no, I do think, I am neither a cynic nor a romantic. I don't do this with the idea that, well, there's nothing else that one could do, or on the other hand, that this is the solution to all the world's problems. I believe very strongly in the normative potential of the idea of human rights. I believe very strongly in the idea that it is still a vocabulary in which different sorts of claims can be articulated. In some of the recent discussions about, for example, the relationship between human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals, I think it is interesting to think about the overlaps between the different frameworks, as well as some of the remnants in which an overlap is missing. But in any case, I never meant to suggest that human rights was a vocabulary that we should ditch. So just thank you very much for raising the question, because it would have been terrible to give that impression in the room. Now, on the other sorts of questions, and I will be brief, not at least checking myself, I have a tendency to provide long answers. On the question of anthropology and law, this is an interdisciplinary field, and I think that its ultimate success depends entirely on this, but I don't think that we are always very successful at integrating the different types of knowledge in as seamless a way as we could. I think that we have come a long, long way, for example, within truth commissions at streamlining different fields of expertise, knowledge, and approaches, including on gender issues, I must say. So since the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there is no commission that has not tried seriously to streamline gender concerns, including, perhaps in some ways surprisingly, the Moroccan Commission, with which I work very closely. And here an anecdote. In my first meeting with the plenary of the commission, a commission that was composed of 16 men and 1 woman, I asked them, as I often do, so what do you think our reparations plan can do for the country? And I can, in a different context, talk about some of the responses that I have gotten. But I asked them specifically, what are some of your initial thoughts about how to deal with gender and sexually based violations? And one of the commissioners raised his hands and he said, Monsieur de Greiff, this is a Muslim country, we have no such problems. So I said, I don't consider myself a country expert, but if what you are telling me is true, this would make out of Morocco a total outlier in any country that has faced systematic human rights violations. Well, that was the starting point. The end point was one of the most seriously gender-based reparation programs of any commission that I am familiar with, including, for example, not towing the Sharia regulation in favor of inheritance towards husbands or the first children, but making women the direct beneficiaries of the compensation. So we have learned a lot. Anthropologists, historians, sociologists, political scientists are now solidly part of the teams in all truth commissions today, and also in most prosecutorial mechanisms as well. So I think that we have come a long way, but still, this is not to say that we have done everything that we can, and that, for example, on the question of intergenerational transmission of effects, we still have a very, very long way to go, not just in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of practical ways of addressing the issue. Most reparation programs, most truth commissions, most prosecutorial mechanisms have, for example, deadlines that are totally incompatible with the idea of providing redress multi-generational. So we have a long way to go there. I just want to say, this is a process we have started, it's not all lost. On the question of Rwanda and Bolivia, so this is complicated, and I have to say I don't consider myself a country expert on either. The way that I would approach this is the following. I made an argument against the formalization of the field. The international community gave the Rwandan Gacaca experiment a very hard time, not without justification. On the other hand, if we are serious about the idea that there is no single solution to problems, I think that we also have to be tolerant towards experimentation of the sort that the Rwandese with some risk and at some expense undertook. Again, there's a long story and a long discussion to be had about the merits or demerits of the approach, but the idea that there is no perfect solution that we already know, that from the outside we can dictate to a country in which, for example, because of demographic factors, people at some point or another have to start living as neighbors again. But after a tragedy of this sort has taken place, where legal services were completely decimated, 16 lawyers left alive in Rwanda after the massacre, in the country as a whole, and not one specialized trauma psychologist. I mean, that in a country in that situation, an effort is made to achieve some degree of accountability that, of course, is deficient in many ways compared to what we would have done elsewhere. I don't think that should have been surprising. And I always wondered whether the role of the international community could have been much more positive initially than at the outset, saying what we are trying to do is unacceptable and impossible. It's easy to do that. It's much more difficult to say, okay, here we are. Because one of the consequences of what I am saying about the sensitivity to context cannot be that what I am trying to argue for is that justice is a luxury that only the affluent can afford, and that only them should try it. I think that the message ought to be, if the international community is interested in the achievement of certain standards of justice, it has to make itself much more present in those situations in which countries are trying, and yet in which they face odds that are far longer than those that, for example, were faced by Chile. So I did a sort of back of the envelope calculation of government income per capita on taxes at the time of different transitional periods. When the Chilean transition took place, the Chilean government received, by way of taxation, more than $600 per citizen. When the Liberian agreement was signed, Liberia received less than $22 per capita. In 2008, the Afghan government received $8 per capita. So let's be clear about what this means. This is $8 for everything: payment of debt, interests, infrastructure, health, education, and justice. So the international community wants to be very, very tough on Rwanda. Well, it has to be serious. We have to put our money where our mouth is.
I'm afraid I've gotten the signal from my friend in the back that our time in this plenary is up, but we will have, and we so much appreciate your elaborate answers. Actually, we so much appreciate your entire intervention. So I would like us to thank Pablo and convene at the reception at the law school.
It's just as we go out, oh, I didn't realize there were so many behind. Just as we go out of the faculty house, turn left and it's 3 doors down.
Anyway, please give our
10
heartfelt
yards on
thanks
the left.
to